Hi everyone, Stjepan here. Today I'm going to start a series on the Scotch game, and as always I'm very happy to start a new opening. So in this series we are going to be looking at 6 different variations in the Scotch game, some of them sounder than others, and we are particularly going to focus on 2 lines, the classical and the Steinitz Scotch, which have been played most often, and especially the Steinitz, which has been played by Anatoly Karpov when Garry Kasparov introduced the Scotch game back into Grandmaster play. So as always, first I'm making an introductory video. Here I'm going to try to go over the main ideas for both sides, and I'm going to talk about all the variations briefly, and then I'm going to make 6 separate videos, 1 video on each key variations. Some of them I'm going to skip, some variations, some sidelines, because they really don't seem that important, but I would advise you to look at them nonetheless if you play the Scotch, or if you face the Scotch if you play e5, because they're sort of easy to refute or to memorize, but there are about 20 of them, so it would take too much time and too many videos. Okay, so let's get into the opening. First of all, the Scotch game got its name after a correspondence match played in 1824 between London and Edinburgh, in which obviously the players played it, and that's where it's got its name. And it hasn't really been used in the 20th century. It's sort of still a romantic opening, being played in the 19th century. It has also been featured in opening books back then, and it got a lot of attention even. But in the 20th century, when serious chess started being played, it got sort of neglected because it was thought that white releases the central tension too early in the Scotch, and that's why you can't really have a serious game without central pawn tension. So I'm just going to put the starting position on the board. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now the standard moves bishop b5 in the Spanish, or Ruy Lopez, bishop c4, and some other ideas in the king's pawn opening. But d4, the Scotch game, is quite a different approach. And of course, what white is doing, white is trying to trade his d4 pawn for white's e5 pawn. And you could argue whether the trade is good for white or not. One thing that is certain is that it does release the central tension, and you're not going to have a locked down king's pawn center as you do in the Spanish or the Italian, where both sides have to maneuver their pieces around, have to take time developing their pieces, have ideas of having outposts on f4 and f5. And the games are quite different. Now, once black takes, and as we are going to see, it's by far the best move, the thing that happens is that white's e-pawn is free to move, which never happens in e4, e5 openings, almost never. And that changes the nature of the game significantly. On the other hand, this pawn, if it doesn't move, then it will have to be defended. If it moves, then it might get overextended, and white will have a hard time defending it. So there are subtleties in the position which I would say are completely different to the other openings which we've seen so far, namely the Spanish and the Italian. So the Scotch game is quite controversial, and it changes the nature of the position, you might argue not in white's favor, but it's perfectly playable, it's quite aggressive, and Garry Kasparov is responsible for bringing it to the highest level. As I said before, Garry Kasparov played it. It was considered that this position after knight takes d4 was sort of equal, and that white allowed black to equalize easily, let's say with a move bishop to c5, and that black is going to have an easy game. So nobody really saw an advantage for white in that, but Garry Kasparov did. And in his 1990 match against Anatoly Karpov, he introduced it as a complete novelty. Before that, it was considered to be a romantic 19th century opening, which almost nobody played. It was played maybe 10 times on high levels per year. And then when he played it, it was quite a surprise. In the first game, it was their 14th game in the match, played in Lyon. They drew, and then in round 16, Garry Kasparov won, so he employed it successfully. Now, the ideas behind the Scotch are that instead of attacking the e5 pawn indirectly with the move bishop to b5, as white does in the Ruy Lopez, so trying to remove the defender of e5, or playing for weaknesses with the move bishop c4, as white does in the Italian, playing for f7, white now directly challenges the pawn and asks for more central space. And of course, once the pawn is taken, white does have more space in the center and he's able to push his pawn forward. Now we are going to look at several different variations. First of all, I would like to mention that after the move d4, black has different options apart from taking the pawn, but none of them are really good. Firstly, the move d6 isn't really that good. White can play d5 here, gaining space, and white can also play bishop to b5, trying to win the knight, and after e takes d4, queen takes d4. White has obviously better development, and white has the initiative, and white has more space in the center and more central control. So the move d6 really isn't advisable. The second idea, which has been played in the 19th century, but today nobody really plays it, is the move knight takes d4, because now after knight takes d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4, white of course has the centralized queen, which is much more active than black's queen, and he also has a pawn controlling key central squares f5 and d5, so white here definitely has an edge. It's nothing major, but from a theoretical standpoint, white is better. Let's say queen to f6, e5, queen b6, bishop to e3, and whatever black does, white is slightly better. So taking with the knight isn't good, d6 isn't good. Another move that has been played, but it's sort of strange, is the move knight to f6. Now white can simply react with d takes c5, knight takes e4, bishop to c4, putting pressure here. And after d6, there's a trick in this position, which you should know with the white pieces. d6 is a very normal move, but still, here's proof that the move knight to f6 isn't good. Bishop takes f7, king takes f7, queen to d5 check, bishop e6, queen e4, and white has a significant advantage. The king is misplaced. The material is equal after black recaptures the pawn, of course, but black is going to have a hard time defending this. So d6 doesn't work, knight d4 doesn't work, knight f6 doesn't work. Another move that has been tried is the move d5. This one I actually think is interesting. You might confuse white, but it's definitely no good. After knight takes e5, d e4, bishop b5, pinning the knight, bishop d7, bishop takes, knight c6, bc6, castles. You can see that white has a dream position here. Equal material, ruined pawn structure for black, two isolated doubled pawns, two weaknesses. And of course, e4 is weak. If f5 is played, then the king is weak, and black is basically losing this position. So after d4, no other options really. You have to take the pawn. And now white on the highest level is always going to take back with the knight. You are never going to see anything else on the absolutely highest level. So knight takes d4 is the most sensible move, simply recapturing the pawn and giving black the option to decide. Two other moves which have been played and which are quite popular are two Gambit Lines, which I like, I have to say. Both produce extremely interesting games, or better say bishop c4 produces interesting games. c3 really isn't justifiable in my opinion. So let's look at c3 first. This is the Garry Gambit. Now black can of course take the pawn or not take the pawn. d5 and takes are two moves here. I think taking on c3 is perfectly fine, winning a pawn. Knight takes c3, bishop b4. Black definitely has good development. It's not as if white is developing all of his pieces with tempo. d6 castles. Okay, white has a lead in development, but black has a pawn and white doesn't have that much to show for it. Still, there are some interesting lines. We are going to look at the variation in a detailed video, because black can of course go wrong after this. A much more interesting move though is the move bishop to c4, and this is the Scotch Gambit. This is, well, I actually like this variation, and I'm thinking of picking it up, and I've seen it played. We actually looked at one game today with a 2200 player playing it against a 2350. The player with black pieces won, but he was a stronger player. So here there are two moves, knight f6 and bishop c5. Whatever black does, white gets a dangerous initiative, and black has to know what he is doing. After knight f6, e5 is a natural looking move, d5, bishop b5, knight e4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, bishop c6, bc6, castles. Well, you could argue who's better here. I prefer white because of the structure. And another very interesting move after bishop c4 is bishop c5, which is not as popular as knight to f6, and now white has several options. c3 is the normal option, the main move, but there's a very interesting temporary piece sacrifice with knight to g5. And this black really does have to know well. So here knight to h6 is the main move, and now white sacrifices because of this trick, queen h5, winning the bishop on c5. So now knight x7, bishop f7, check, king takes, queen h5, winning the bishop. And you have a tricky position in which the material is equal, strangely enough. And I would rather have white because of the king safety and because I think it's easier to play, but in practice black scores really well. So this we are going to look at in detail. So those two gambits are what people play unless they take the pawn. And as I said, taking the pawn is the best thing. So now knight takes d4 gives black several options. These several options, well, we are going to look at in detail. We are going to look at bishop c5, knight f6, bishop b4 check, and queen h4. Even though there are some other variations, there's a line with queen f6, there's g6, there's d6, but those are really strange sidelines which white can easily gain an advantage against, so I wouldn't want to go in them in depth, but I would advise you, if you play the Scotch, have a brief look at g6, d6 and queen f6 just to make sure you don't blunder anything. And the two main variations are bishop c5 and knight to f6. One sideline I would like to mention once again is knight takes d4, and now after queen takes d4 we are back to the position we were looking at before, where black captures on move 3. So we have the same position, and this I really wouldn't recommend. Once again, a more active queen for white in the center, and black has nothing in compensation for that. So after knight takes d4, the four moves I want to look at, firstly, queen to h4. This is a strange variation called the Steinitz variation, named after Wilhelm Steinitz, an aggressive-looking move which puts pressure on the e4 pawn, and it involves, in some positions, a temporary pawn sacrifice for white, which could put black in trouble. However, if white doesn't know what he's doing, it's unlikely that he's going to enter the sacrifice. So let's say knight c3. Now after bishop b4, if I had this position on the board, if I didn't know what to do with white, I would be really scared. The main move might surprise you is bishop to e2, and bishop to e2 simply hangs the pawn. And now after queen takes c4, there's a very strong move here, knight b5, and after bishop takes c3, b takes c3, king to d8 has to be played, and after castles white has an advantage. He has given up a pawn, but has more than enough compensation for that. So queen to h4 has interesting lines like that, so the Steinitz variation is definitely something to look out for, and if white isn't prepared, it could be deadly. Another line which isn't as popular as the two main moves, which we are going to cover, is bishop to b4 check, the Malaniuk variation, and this almost always enters the classical variation with the move c3 interposed for white. White has other options here, of course. White can cover the check with the bishop or with the knight, but has to be careful not to blunder his d4 knight in the process. But the main move is c3, and after c3, bishop c5, you have the classical variation in which, let's imagine that black plays bishop to c5 immediately. Then it's white to move, and white doesn't have the pawn on c3. So this is basically the classical variation, with white already having played c3. Now the debate is whether c3 is a nuisance or a good move. In my opinion, you don't get to develop your knight to c3, which can be a really bad thing. If you have to develop the knight to d2, then your e4 pawn is protected, but your knight is not, and you might hang a pawn there. So it's definitely double-edged and interesting to learn the variation and to know the plans without your knight on c3 as white. So we're going to look at the Malaniuk variation for that reason. And now we come to the two main variations, basically the classical and the Schmidt variation. After bishop c5, the classical, white has several moves. Knight takes c6 is one of them. Simply doubling black's pawns if black isn't careful. Queen f6 is the main move, threatening checkmate. Of course, the knight really can be recaptured afterwards. Queen f3, and now bc6 is the main move. You can take with the d pawn, you can take with the queen, but b takes is the more popular option because of d5. Now let's say knight to d2, and the variation goes on like that. After bishop to c5, other options are knight to b3, playing a sort of Caro-Kann position in reverse, on the other side of the board, that is. And now after bishop b6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4. Black actually stands well here, and white has to be careful misplacing his pieces away from the center and sort of bringing them into inactive squares. This bishop is now deadly. This one really isn't that good in my opinion. And the white knights don't really exert enough influence in my opinion. In fact, the engine thinks that this line with knight to b3 is better for black, which is strange on move 8. And after bishop c5, the main move thought to give white a slight edge is bishop to e3. The interesting thing is that the engines think that the position is equal. So you could argue that if this is the main line of the Scotch, that the opening is slightly unsound, but I think it's fine, and it's really hard to prove that black has already equalized. Queen f6 is the main move, putting even more pressure on the knight, and now c3, once again forcing white to a concession, taking away the c3 square from the knight, knight g to e7, bishop c4, knight e5, bishop e2, saving the bishop, queen g6, castles, d6 and f3. Bishop h3 doesn't work because of rook to f2. And it's a complex position, and in my opinion, white has managed to achieve something, and that something is an imbalanced position in which he's going to have different attacking chances than in normal king's pawn openings, and that's why I find the variation interesting still. I believe that it's perfectly playable for black, and that if black knows what he's doing, the Scotch can be a less deadly weapon than the Ruy Lopez or the Italian. If I turn on the engine now, the engine thinks that white has a slight advantage, plus 0.3, so nothing major. And the most interesting, in my opinion, variation, if we come back to this position, knight takes d4, is the move knight to f6. Knight to f6 is called the Schmidt variation, but perhaps it should be called the Kasparov variation, because Kasparov basically developed all the modern theory on the opening. Well, he developed what white should be doing. And in Kasparov-Karpov 1990, this variation became really popular. Afterwards, most grandmasters choose the move knight to f6. They're tied, bishop c5 and knight to f6, but most stronger players choose knight to f6 instead of bishop c5. After the move knight to f6, the line is pretty forced. There are several options. White can continue with knight to c3, entering a peaceful position, but one critical line, which is considered to be very good for white and double-edged, is taking on c6, and after knight takes c6, b takes c6, once again saving the option for d5. White continues with e5, the queen goes to e7, pinning the pawn, the queen defends with e2, the knight goes to d5, and now c4. And this is the starting position. And this has been played by Kasparov and Karpov several times. It has also been played by Jan Timman and several other players in the 90s, and today it's one of the most common lines, as I said, once again, introduced by Garry Kasparov. Here, the position is quite complicated, and as opposed to other king-pawn openings, which are e4, e5 openings, which are maneuvering and peaceful, and both sides have to develop their pieces in several moves, this is quite scary. Black can continue with knight to b6 or bishop a6, pinning the pawn to the queen, so this is the starting position, and from this move knight to b6 the position branches out. One most important feature of the position is the overextended e5 pawn for white. There are three options. The first one is that black is simply going to win the pawn and win the game. The second is that white is going to be able to defend the pawn successfully and have a maneuvering game. And the third one, which Garry Kasparov wanted to do and often succeeded, is that he got to sacrifice the pawn in the perfect moment to get initiative or time or whatever, and then create a deadly attack. So the game is going to revolve around e5, and whether white is going to use it as a battering ram or if he's going to blunder it and lose the game. So this variation, the Schmidt variation, I think we are going to focus most on, because this is the most critical line. But coming back to the opening, after d4, the Scotch game, I always have had the opinion that it's far less theoretical than Ruy Lopez or the Italian game, but it turns out that there's a ton of theory to know here, ton of tricks which you could use to defeat your opponents quickly, and fun options for black and for white, and it's quite an extraordinary opening worth learning. Of course, if you play e5, then you face it very often today, and if you play e4, it might be a great surprise weapon to pick up, or even to be used as your main weapon. I think it's very interesting. Okay, 6 more videos. I'm going to create a separate video on each variation listed on the right side of the screen. As I said, we are going to focus most on the Schmidt and the classical variation because they are the soundest. And we are also going to cover bishop c4 and c3, two scary looking but good for black lines. Let me know what you think about the Scotch. Let me know if you have any suggestions. Please leave them in the comments below. Once again, thank you for the support and the comments, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Thank you.